In 2021, Indian scholar Sai Deepak wrote a book entitled India, There is Bharat, Coloniality, Civilization, Constitution. The book argues for the reconceptualization of India, known by its alternative name, Bharat, as the, quote, civilizational state of the Hindu people. The book is nominally written from a very overt decolonial approach and heavily implies that India's current constitution is nothing but the denouement of a longer process of colonial domination, the product of India's leadership's distancing from its Indic indigenous roots. Thus, Deepak ends the book by telling his reader that he has, quote, fleshed out the direct causal nexus, nay, umbilical cord, he says, between the global history of European coloniality and Bharat's tryst with it, in particular in the realm of the Constitution until 1919-1920. He hopes, he goes on, that this will lead the readers to become aware of their own preconceived notions about Bharat brought about by unconscious and conscious coloniality before holding forth on the need for, quote, reform or the virtues of, quote, secularism. Reform, in the context of Bharat, he sentences, must be decolonial. Seen in isolation, the book seemed to follow the fundamental recipe of decolonial theory that I explained in a previous video. De-link from Western modernity and find a non-Western macro-narrative with which to tell the story of not India, but Bharat. In fact, plastered prominently in the book's praise section was none other than Walter Mignolo himself, one of the key voices of the decolonial theory movement. Sai Deepak builds a strong decolonial argument, disengaging from Western modern orthodoxy of the either-or and proposes instead the decolonial logic of neither-nor. He does this by means of a detailed and careful reconstitution of knowledges, ways of knowing, and patterns of sensing that were destituted and continued to be so in the name of progress, democracy, and economic development, Mignolo says. Sai Deepak, Mignolo concludes, invites us to think and work decolonially towards pluriversal futures. Within days of publication, many post-colonial scholars, particularly many of South Asian background, began to flood Twitter with harsh critiques of Mignolo. Priyan Vadagopal, professor of post-colonial studies at the Faculty of English in Cambridge, called his blurb, quote, appalling and disgraceful. Dipyesh Anand, professor and at the time head of the School of Social Sciences of the University of Westminster, protested exasperately. What's next? Will he be invited to Delhi to sing laurels for Modi, erasing, quote, foreign influence of Muslims in India too? Rahul Rao, reader in international political thought in the School of International Relations at the University of St. Andrews, sentenced that the, quote, insidious and opportunistic use of post-colonial decolonial concepts by Hindutva apologists is worse than clueless decoloniality. Hindutva refers to an ideology of Hindu supremacism popular with today's ruling government in India. It advances the theory that India, or Bharat, belongs to Hindus, not to Muslims. A difficult claim to make for a country with the third largest population of Muslims in the world. In fact, throughout the book, Deepak explicitly calls Indian Muslim culture, quote, Middle Eastern colonialism in India. Thus, the decolonial claim in India that is Bharat is a dishonest one. It seeks to use the decolonial proposal of delinking from modernity to advance a Hindu colonial approach to India's Muslim minority. In painting India's constitution as Western colonialism, Deepak seeks to discredit its famous declaration of India as a, quote, secular state that protects minorities, in order to, as Anandarup Sen put it, quote, unfurl a politics of hurt and resentment. A book that, he says, feeds into a growing list of right-wing nationalist techniques developed to gain ground electorally and intellectually. Decoloniality in this book is a tactic of majoritarian ethnic violent politics to appear as a specific victim of the colonial past, he says. Within hours, Mignolo himself took to, Facebook, to calm the waters. He said, quote, a while ago, Sai Deepak contacted me about his new book, requesting an endorsement. I read the introduction, exchanged messages, asked some questions. He sent me the book. I felt some affinities with his argument and endorsed it. I was not aware of his political position. When I learned about it, I realized that we are in opposite camps and requested him and the editor to withdraw my endorsement. So what happened? How did a theory meant to empower indigenous people ended up being wielded in the service of ethnic supremacy? Is there a flaw at the heart of a, quote, clueless decolonial theory? As we discussed discussed in a previous video, decolonial theory argues that the end of colonization is not the end of coloniality, that even after colonialism as a political process ends, post-colonial societies continue to be ruled by post-colonial structures and epistemologies that place the white Western male as the epitome of human evolution. Thus, decolonization is not enough. Post-colonial societies also need to achieve decoloniality, an epistemic decolonization that allows them to tackle these colonial structures and reshape their societies. Thus, to decolonize, say, Latin America, it is important to understand the ways of knowing of its indigenous people. Explore, for instance, the Quechua notion of Pachacuti or of Kausai, and build new societies from those new non-Western rules. For Mignolo, for instance, Latin America itself is a westernized concept. Quote, not so much a subcontinent, he says, but the political project of Creole mestizo elites. You remember from my video on decolonial theory that the Creoles, or criollos in the original Spanish, and as I like to call them, are white descendants of Europeans in Latin America, and that the mestizos are people of mixed racial background. So Latin America stood in contrast with Anglo-Saxon America. It is not a geography, but a geopolitical project of the hegemonic white elites. As Mignolo explains, through a process called mestizaje, or the mixing of races, these elites sought to create a new type of national identity, not the melting pot of the US politics, where different communities coexist in separate, clearly defined spaces, but the mixture of indigenous, black, and criollo. But even in this supposedly multicultural project, colonial modernity reared its ugly head. Mestizaje became a way for people of indigenous and black heritage to whiten, quote-unquote, enough to pass as part of the hegemonic Ibero-American elite of Hispanic race. In other words, this was yet another colonial structure invisibilizing indigeneity and racial discrimination in the Americas. This is why Mignolo and other decolonial scholars in fact reject the term, quote, Latin America in its entirety, instead preferring to use Abya-Yala, a word from the indigenous Kuna language of Central America that refers to the entire territorial mass of the Americas. Thus, presumably, Mignolo saw in Deepak an attempt to de-link India from Western modernity and recover its indigenous Hindu character as Bharat, another non-Western name in a similar vein to how he tries to de-link Latin America from Western modernity and recover the ways of thinking of its indigenous people and calling it Abya-Yala. Of course, this was only the case because, by his own admission, Mignolo literally only read the book's introduction, and only in passing at that. Deepak is clear, even in the introduction, that he opposes not just European coloniality, but what he deems Middle Eastern coloniality. Thus, he continues, quote, Bharat's version of decoloniality must address both forms of coloniality, the European one and the Middle Eastern one, to preserve its, quote, civilizational character. In other words, he is conceiving India in nationalistic terms to the exclusion of the other people who live in it. To make a rough simile, what Deepak is doing is akin to saying that, say, Peru is the birthplace of the Andean civilization of Aymaras and Quechuas, and that therefore there is no place in it for Afro-Peruvians or Niseis, Peruvian Japanese, or Tusans, Peruvian Chinese, and all the other communities that live in the country, who'd rather be conceived as foreign. And any constitution that recognizes them rights is therefore colonial and, or at the very least, follows the European tradition of coloniality through secularism and human rights. This would, of course, not just be absurd, but profoundly contrary to human rights and decolonial theory. Still, the fact that it worked, the fact that decolonial theory could even be deployed in this way and trick one of its most important representatives into endorsing supremacist ideology, raised important alarms in the academic community. What went wrong? The main response from post-colonial theorists is that the decolonial argument requires us to do an impossibility, to fully de-link from modernity. Can that be done? Think about it. If Western modernity started through the colonial encounter of 1492, then what does de-linking mean? Does it mean going back to 1491 and determining what indigenous people thought and understood before being polluted by the West? Or does it mean that through 5 centuries, indigenous people have been able to remain fully unpolluted by Western identities, and so their lived experience can be neatly split into a Western and non-Western component? Neither sounds very convincing. The 5 centuries of Western modern colonialism happened, and they are inseparable from and constitutive to indigenous lived experience. Take Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, for instance. She is a Bolivian Aymara anti-colonial scholar. She argues that indigenous people are, quote, above all, contemporary beings and peers that perform and display their own commitment to modernity. In other words, indigenous people are not museum pieces to be admired or exoticized. They are not the guardians of nature, the noble savage, the first peoples, or are they in need of rescuing, as often the modern indigenous rights movement claims. This is a movement, Rivera Kusikanki says, that sees indigeneity as imprisoned in their original communal lands and NGOIs, to the point where, quote, essentialist and orientalist notions become hegemonic and indigenous people are turned into multicultural adornment for neoliberalism. This indigenous rights movement, she says, sees indigeneity as a stereotype of continuous territorial occupation, invariably rural, with a range of ethnic and cultural traits, and classifies indigenous behavior and constructs scenarios for an almost theatrical display of alterity. But that twisted identity that sees indigeneity as separate from modernity is not real. In reality, indigenous people are very much a part of the struggle for modernity. They are literally now organizing and actively fighting for their lands, following in a tradition that goes as far back as the colonial encounter itself. Take the Tupac Amaru Rebellion of 1780, for example. We discussed this in my previous video. As I explained there, this was the largest indigenous rebellion in the history of the Spanish Empire. Tupac Amaru rose up against the indented servitude of indigenous people and over taxation of their trade. Rivera Kusikanki sees in this rebellion the expression of an, quote, indigenous modernity, in which religious and political self-determination signified a retaking of their own historicity, a decolonization of imaginaries and of the forms of representation. In other words, Tupac Amaru changed the world through his rebellion, and this rebellion was a part of the history of Western modernity. And indeed, he did, and it was. The ultimate independence of Peru was delayed by a full decade because of it. The formation of the modern Peruvian state took shape in reaction to it, including by presenting the new authorities of this supposedly liberal republic with a conundrum. The indented servitude of indigenous people could not be liberal. It was part of imperial oppression. It is what led post-independence Peru to abolish indigenous tribute and indented servitude, kicking off the process of capitalist hacienda expansion and feudal exploitation seen in the previous video. This was modern indigenous history. This is part of the history of Western modernity. In fact, it shaped it. This was not just the case in Latin America. Writing in the context of the British Empire, Professor Priyanvada Gopal argues that it was resistance to empire, not empire itself, that led to the emergence and formation of the ideas of liberty, equality, and free enterprise we now think about when we think about the West. So, argues Professor Gopal, we have it backwards. Capitalist modernity did not lead to Western ideas of freedom and equality. Subaltern resistance to it did. The colonized and enslaved rose up against the injustice of empire and through their discourse and actions paved the way for others in the metropole to take up the fight. In other words, Western modernity is not per se only Western. It is instead very much co-constructed with the non-Western world. Okay, so we have concluded that there might indeed be a flaw in the decolonial recipe for decolonization. Delinking from modernity is not possible because modernity itself was co-constructed by the resistance of the non-Western. It would rob the indigenous of their struggles if we simply separated them from this co-constructed modernity. But then, what does this mean for decolonization? If not decoloniality, then what? Silvia Rivera Kusikanki proposes a new concept, cheje, an Aymara word signifying a color that is the product of juxtaposition in small points or spots of opposed or contrasting colors, black and white, red and green, and so on. It is usually used in the context of weaving, but beyond that, it is an idea that reflects something that is and is not at the same time. A motley society that expresses the parallel coexistence of multiple cultural differences that do not extinguish but instead antagonize and complement each other. In a cheje society, the colonial logic of Western modernity, where West is best, would no longer apply. Race would stop being the organizing principle of society and everyone would live together on truly equal terms. Not the equality of the Enlightenment that never really stooped down to apply to the colonized and racialized, but actual, real, post-colonial equality. Now, if modernity is cheje, but its cheje nature is ignored by the workings of coloniality, what does that tell us about the world we have constructed? Fausto Reinaga, a Bolivian Aymara himself, wrote in his book The Indian Revolution that the main problem with revolutionary ideologies is that they conceive the, quote, Indio, the indigenous person of the Americas as he describes them, as a social class, the so-called campesino. Now, campesino is a tricky word to translate. Literally, it means peasant, but in the context of Latin America, it is more akin to a small-scale rural farmer of indigenous origin. It is not enough, he says, to try to incorporate the campesinado, that is the campesino sectors of society, into specific political movements, to make the campesinado join the communist revolution or the liberal establishment, etc. No. Reinaga reconceives all indigenous people in Bolivia as a single nation, the Collasuyo, which remains oppressed under a Western-style nation-state called Bolivia. Reinaga calls this situation one of two Bolivias and calls for both Bolivias to merge into one, where indigenous people have self-determination. There's more to say about Reinaga, and not all of it good, because some of his writings veer into the same kind of nation civilization style as Deepak does, but that is best left for another video. I will instead take his argument of the artificiality of the Western nation state as a form of social organization and build from that on. So if modernity must acknowledge its Cheche character, then it should accept the fundamental flaw at the heart of the nation state. This is a system based on the false notion that the ethnic uniformity of the, quote, nation is normal. In this sense, France is for the French and Germany is for the Germans. But what makes someone German? What is Germanness? Why is it that the difference between a Catholic Bavarian and a Protestant Prussian is acceptable within the big umbrella of Germanness, but not a Frenchman from Strasbourg by last name Müller living 1 kilometer away from the German border? Why is his difference French, not German? Is it that Germanness exists and so a, quote, Germany is or should be built around all Germans, which frankly sounds kind of fascisty Lebensraum-y to me? Or is it that we first established where Germany was in a map and then constructed Germanness out of a series of different people who happened to live within this territory? In other words, is Bavarian culture German, or is it that Bavarians are German because they happened to live in what we decided is Germany? And it is this arbitrarily constructed concept of the nation that serves to exclude anyone who is not in it. This is how you get discourses like, quote, the French football team is not really French, or Muslims cannot be European, etc. So in a Cheche modernity, these exclusions would need to come down in order for plurinational, inclusive nations to emerge. But perhaps we can talk about plurinationalism more in another video. For now, it is enough to say that decolonization through the embrace of Cheche co-construction requires us to rethink the idea of the nation and nationalism and focus instead on the concept of the human, or more exactly, who are we excluding from humanity and why? All because of these notions of nationalistic racism. We tend, for instance, to think of, quote, humanity as an all-encompassing term that incorporates all humans. We like to think our shared concept of a common humanity with specific moral values sets us apart from animals, that there is no dogality or catality. But we often forget that we have struggled as a humankind to uphold the idea of a, quote, humanity in the face of our other human traits: racism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, coloniality. We have, therefore, to quote Aicha Chubukchu, constructed a humanity where, quote, violence is central and hierarchy is intrinsic to its political and ethical operations. It's a humanity that incorporates a subhumanity within it. Some people are simply not counted as human because they are racialized, otherized, and discriminated as an other. Whether this concept of humanity can be rescued is an ongoing discussion in post-colonial circles. From Arendt to Malcolm X, many have discussed the lack of a right to, quote, have rights as a key problem for our understanding of human rights. Scholars like Chubukchu even ponder whether we should move away from this concept of humanity and subhumanity and find better ways to advance solidarity between humans, all humans, where no, quote, subcategory exists. This, I would argue, is a Cheche concept of co-constructed modernity, one where all humans are seen as human. I think it is important to end this video essay with a warning, though. If modernity is co-constructed and coloniality endures even in post-colonial states, then it is key to not idealize the post-colonial state. As James Gathey argues, it is important to not have a false notion of third-world innocence and first-world guilt or dominance. The reality of a co-constructed modernity is that states, all states, well, suck. Countries with a history of colonialism can also themselves deploy colonial structures of domination. I've already explored, for instance, how Peruvian elites deployed coloniality against Peru's indigenous peoples. The fact that they had been themselves under Spanish colonial domination does not exclude their own colonial designs. This is not just a Latin American process. Take, for instance, the case of Meiji Japan in the 19th century. In 1868, Japan decided that the only way to overcome the unequal treaties forced upon it by the American fleet of Commodore Matthew Perry in 1853 was to, quote, civilize, abandoning the feudal Han system of centuries past, where specific daimyo, similar to like the European feudal lords, managed the fiefdom on behalf of the shogun. In 1875, Fukusawa Yokichi, a former samurai turned influential thinker, wrote a book entitled An Outline of a Theory of Civilization, arguing that, facing the risk of European colonization, Japan had to, quote, save the belly at the cost of the back. Japan needed to gain the respect of these foreigners if it was to survive. Quote, wherever the Europeans touch, Fukusawa said, the land withers up, as it were. The plants and trees stop growing. Sometimes even whole populations have been wiped out. As soon as one learns such things and realizes that Japan is also a country in the East, then though we have not as yet been seriously harmed by foreign relations, we might as well fear that the worst is yet to come, Fukusawa says. So, following Fukusawa's dicta, Meiji Japan set out to destroy the regional power of the region, China, and colonize its neighbor, Korea, to impress the West. So how did they do this? How did they justify it? Well, they racialized them. In the words of one Japanese military officer, Arika Nagao, the Chinese, quote, can be compared with the Turks, the Arabs, he used a racist term to refer to the perceived skin color of Native Americans that I will not repeat here, but you get the idea. Right? To impress the West, racialization was necessary. So in other words, just like the non-Western resistance to Western coloniality helped shape a co-constructed modernity, those non-Western states that embraced modernity advanced its colonial objectives as well. Under the post-colonial critique of decolonial theory, therefore, the objective of decolonization is the anti-colonial reconception of the co-constructed modernity into its Cheche variant that does not invisibilize the non-Western world in its formation. The objective is not the idealization of the non-Western world or the idea that one can fully extricate the non-Western world from modernity. In sum, decolonial theory agrees with other post-colonial approaches that the colonial encounter of 1492 changed the world. It created Western modernity and led to coloniality. Some post-colonial approaches disagree with the decolonials, however, on how to decolonize modernity. While the decolonials propose a delinking from modernity and the rediscovery of non-Western ways of thinking, anti-colonial approaches argue that it is impossible to separate these non-Western ways of thinking from modernity. Because non-Western resistance to and or embrace of Western modernity is a part of the process that co-constructed it. The way to decolonization, therefore, is to reinsert the non-Western side of modernity into it. The creation of what Rivera Kusikanki calls a Cheche modernity, where our concept of humanity abandons the notion of the subhuman, as Chibukcho notes. This Cheche world would in theory lead to the re-evaluation of several institutions that so far seem almost natural to the modern world, like, for example, the very notion of the nation state. In another video, I will explore how this can be done by exploring the notion of plurinationality. But for now, that's it. So thanks for watching.